All right, we're going to go ahead and start. My name is Emily Wu. I'm a social justice faculty at Dominican and the Assistant Director of Service Learning. I want to invite you into this space, and I'll start with reading a land acknowledgement before we start the official program. So here it is. We welcome you into the space of virtual gathering. We begin by acknowledging that Dominican University of California occupies the ancestral lands of the Federated Indians of Greater Rancheria and Coast Miwok people. As California has always been the home to the largest number of indigenous peoples and their cultures amongst all states, we also recognize our neighboring indigenous peoples, primarily but not limited to the Patwin and the Wapo to the east, the Olon to the south, and the Pomo to the north. We further acknowledge that Zoom, the platform we use for this event, is headquarters in what is now called San Jose, California, on the ancestral lands of Olon, Temyen, and Muwekma peoples. We acknowledge the land Zoom resides on, as the digital platform is made possible because of physical land and the indigenous people who stored it. Okay, thank you. And I will let George take this away. Thank you.
Hi, I'm George Satzel, professor of religion and philosophy, also in the social justice program. And I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors. Dominican is co-sponsoring the event, collaborating with funds from the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Religion and Theology in Crawfordsville, Indiana. Also collaborating with significant help from the Church of the Redeemer, an Episcopal Church in San Rafael. So hi, Father Jim, representing from there, as well as with the Museum of the American Indian in Novato, whose executive director, Tori Canby, is going to introduce our speaker today.
Hi, thank you for having me, and I'm so happy to be part of this collaboration. And I'm so happy to be here with Kim. Being part of the museum, one of the most awesome parts of being part of the museum is that I get to meet incredible people like Kim. Kim is a native artist, a poet, an author, 2017 Poet Laureate of San Francisco, professor, just amazing all around human being. And yes, welcome, Kim. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. There's nothing like being around long enough to have a list of things you accomplish. It's been a huge pleasure to have met you as well, Tori, and I'm grateful to be here. I'm coming to you from Ramaytush territory in Yelamu, across the bridge, but my partner was actually born and raised in San Rafael, so there's a certain logic to a connection to Marin. I still have a lot of family living over there. I wanted to talk about identity a bit today, which is, I guess the word I want here is tricky topic. And I think I chose it. I think I chose it while I was talking to Tori about something else, but I think I chose it because it's a thing that comes up quite frequently. When I was teaching at San Francisco State University, there were some Pomo teachers there who would always insist, for one thing, that that every tribal entity was different, which is extremely true. And then they'd say that there's no indigenous cultural identity that can be transported from one place to another, which I would argue with, had there ever been an opportunity. So one of the things that that I would love to have happen, and you probably none of you make this mistake, but whenever, it always makes my teeth ache when I hear people say Native American culture and make it singular. It's always got to be plural. I'm Aniumwia. My father was born in northeastern Oklahoma, and he came to San Francisco with the Navy and stayed because it's very, very traditional in my community for the man to come live with the woman's family. And my mother's family has been in San Francisco for a few generations. My identity is complicated. I'm on my mother's side of the family Polish, most of whom were from the Tatra Mountains, Góral, which is a minority in Poland. If you've ever heard of Zakopane, it's a really particular place in the Góral Mountains. And the other half of the family are from the Smoky Mountains, originally before removal, which kind of makes me hillbilly from two different continents. I don't just carry a Native identity. And I always remember an art show that I did where they edited my bio, and my mother came and looked at my bio and was like, how come I'm not on there? So I do that out of respect for both of my parents. I made it even more complicated by marrying a Mongolian and Hawaiian man and having 3 beautiful children with him. So our family holidays are pretty complicated and ubiquitous. We celebrated all of them in an effort to give the kids some kind of way of not losing parts of self that they might find useful and nourishing. So I grew up in San Francisco. My dad was career Navy, and then worked in Silicon Valley doing telecommunications engineering, which in the 60s when I was growing up, and which then became the 70s when I was growing up, a lot of people found that rather startling. I'm a math nerd, and I have written curriculum for the Exploratorium, and folks were like, it seems like an odd job for a Native woman. I'm like, yeah, well, my math nerd stuff comes from the Native side of the family. Jack Kilpatrick, who is, I don't know if he's really well known, but he's a pretty important translator of older Cherokee texts, said of us at one point that our fascination with numbers should have long ago attracted competent psychiatric attention. We're kind of nerdy that way. And generally, any big thing like NASA or the design of computers generally, and specific computers, there's usually some Cherokee person involved in that. I can point to some of them. So there's nothing odd about this culturally, that I do this thing, or that my dad does this thing. And I think a lot of issues that people have with identity is just the spin of problems with stereotyping and how that's played out over the years. But it really does speak to the differences between cultural paradigms within the continental United States for certain, and broadly in the Western Hemisphere. I used to spend about half of my time in London and half of my time in San Francisco. For a couple of years I did that, and I would get people asking me about things like totem poles and stuff, and I used to always use, in Europe, I would use the example of, you have essentially just asked someone from Prague to explain the troubles in Northern Ireland. It's possible I've studied them. It's possible I know some things about them, but what's very true in my case is that I'm not associated necessarily with that tribal background. So the other thing that happens is that people will ask me questions that I have no capacity to answer. I think that's pretty ubiquitous for Native people. We often get asked questions that we have no capacity to answer. I know the one of my children who looks particularly Asian, people will consistently speak Mandarin to him. It's the same problem. He doesn't speak Mandarin. If he spoke Chinese language, it would be Cantonese, because that is the family background in San Francisco. So we're frequently asked these questions as kind of identity tests almost, that we are bound to fail because they're based in expectations that aren't real. And then if I do get asked a question that I have the capacity to answer, what's often also true is that the person asking it does not have the capacity to understand the answer. So you wind up in these little mazes of miscommunication that can be pretty interesting. I was at an event with Tori. It's been such a busy month that I'm not exactly certain how long ago it was. I'm going to say 2 weeks, and we're going to say that that's right. Is that about right, Tori? About 2 weeks?
Indigenous Peoples Day. We could just say that.
Yeah, it was on Indigenous. That's right. It was on Indigenous Peoples Day. And it was too windy to do the thing that I'd come there to do. So I got talked into reading some poetry, which is fine. They had a great PA system, so it worked. And afterwards, I answered some questions. And one woman said, "So you have connection to Oklahoma?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "So the situation of people being murdered for their land rights in Oklahoma, do you want to talk about that?" And I said, "I can absolutely talk about that, except that there are children here. And I totally understand the problem. This happened with my family. My grandmother was adopted out, and it took us some time to figure out what her tribal background was, but it was clear that she had one because the adoption was so crappy. There are certain things that you absolutely know when you look at an adoption. And in Oklahoma, right about the 19 teens, and things are suspicious, and there's absolutely no birth certificate to be found at all. And then 3 of them show up when you start pushing. You can be pretty sure that it's an Indian adoption because they were really awful. But the details of these things are just really so horrific that there are moments when it's not really appropriate to talk about it. And what's also true is that people need to be aware when they ask questions like that this is people's identity. They will have family related to this. And it's a stake through the heart every time. So it was an interesting conversation. I did point that out to her, and it was fun watching her face change. I'm afraid I am very malicious in those moments, and I will make people pay for their questions if it was a bad question. But I'm becoming a cranky old woman, so I take that opportunity where I can get it. So we have these really complicated identities, which involve some people who are really tied to their community identities. My grandfather, my father's father, is a member of a Cherokee family that is probably the most written about Cherokee family, in history, because there are a lot of people who did a lot of things. So, for example, one thing I get asked fairly often, which I brought up earlier before the thing started, one thing I get asked a lot is, aren't you the first person in your family to get a degree? I am emphatically not the first person in my family to get a degree. My great-grandmother's grandfather was the head of the Cherokee Supreme Court. So I am at least a century off of being the first person in my family to get a degree. My father was an engineer for IBM, doing telecommunications engineering during the 70s. And I didn't realize my grandmother had a degree as well until we were going through her stuff afterwards. So I'm nothing like the first. I've been one of the noisiest. Somebody else recently asked me if I was the first writer in my family, which I am. very much not. My grandmother wrote for an entity called the Tri-State Tribune, which sounds very small to people, but is incredibly important in the communities it serves. And also, we are related to somebody you may have heard of. And I just, you know, I really am getting old because I just had his name in my head and I just blanked it. Will Rogers was my grandmother's first cousin. On the other side of the family, Ned Christie was my grandmother's first cousin. And that one you may not have heard of. If you look him up, you will find out that he is listed in Wikipedia as an outlaw. And I would encourage people to look into that a little more deeply. There is some theory that he was killed in order to justify seizure of Indian territory, which became Oklahoma as a state. But that event was way more complicated than it sounds. So I take as my identity in the way that my family does generally, a responsibility to live up to some of the people who've come before us. And I'm descended of lawmakers and troublemakers and moonshiners and a lot of really interesting people. And I have taken it as a job of mine in life to be interesting. And I hope I am. So if I introduce myself to people, I say almost none of what you've just heard, which brings up some interesting questions about what identity really is. Is it your calling card that you hand out when you arrive somewhere? Is it the scaffolding you hang your decision-making process on? Is it your entry card to the Misery Olympics? You know, like where do you end up starting in the 1,000-yard line? You know, how do you take identity? How do you take identity as a Native woman in the 21st century? I was recently told by somebody that a lot of my career was about being in the right place in the right time. Fair enough. I was born just before it became legal all the way across the country for my parents to be having children at all, because the anti-miscegenation laws finally fell a few years after I was born. The year my brother was born, not when he was born, they weren't, they hadn't come down yet, but by the end of his first year they had. So I guess that's lucky, right? Is that I got to grow up not being entirely illegal. I was born at a time when women's rights became a big deal. So by the time it became an issue for me, I could have my own checking account without permission. My supplies for menstruation were not still wrapped in brown paper, although I do remember that early on. So yeah, a lot of things had changed. So I suppose that's pretty lucky too. I was just at a point of being really aware of these things in terms of the forcible sterilization of Indigenous women. Just stopped at about the point where it might have become important to me personally. The other legislation that passed in that year that made our religions more legal came a bit late for me, and I've still got a lot of issues with talking about religion with people who are outside the community, because there's still a little thing in the back of my head that I might be arrested for this. But I think my generation is the last one of those. So I think moving forward, a Native woman's identity will not be tied into that, and that's good news. So it's a bundle of things, and I suppose that it is very true that I'm pretty lucky. I have a weird question. Can everybody hear all the noise going on outside? No, fantastic. A little bit, a little bit. Nothing. Nobody was doing anything outside for all of the hours before this started, and it just started when we started. I apologize. My neighbor's DIY is, anyway. So identity, city and in. And yeah, I do use that word because when I was a kid, that's what we were called, and it's a reflex. I've had people correct that. Which is always great when you're talking about your own identity and somebody's like, well, that's not exactly correct, is it? God, I'm glad you know. It's really helpful. Let's see what else. One thing that I've never really come to terms with is that the education around Indigenous people is so questionable. It's still questionable. There was this horrible book when I was going to elementary school in the school library. The title of which is West with the White Chiefs. And it was really, really bad. It sort of reported to be about Sacagawea, and then wasn't about her at all, except that she was there. And when my kids went to that same elementary school years and years later, I ended up insisting they remove it because it was so bad, but it was still there. There are these things that hang on. And I know that mostly what I'm talking about when I talk about kind of the negative parts about carrying an Indigenous identity now are not my own. But I suppose I have been very lucky in that. Instead of standing in the tact line, I stood in the logic line. And so I've done pretty well in school in spite of being very blunt. Maybe not standing in the tact line has helped a bit. I know that I make cousins laugh all the time by just sort of not having filters. Which may or may not be because if I scored 2 more points, I'd be classed as autistic. So I don't really read the room real well all the time. But I'm really social, which is a weird combination. As a Cherokee woman in California, I'm just as much as an immigrant as everybody who's not in Indigenous California. So I'm a guest here and I know it. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case for all Cherokee people in California. And there are some interesting historical points about that. Although one of the interesting historical points is that the first novel written in California, Qua California, was written by a Cherokee man. So that's a cool thing. Some of the unfortunate things is that the entities sent by the Bureau of Indian Affairs frequently include one of us, and there is at least one person who's not been particularly rigorous in her understanding of the special politics of California and has been, how to put it, problematic in the evolution of communications between Washington and some of the tribes that never got a ratified treaty and therefore are not recognized. So there's a whole thing about Indigenous identity in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly in the United States. If your tribe nation never got a ratified treaty with the United States doesn't recognize you. Which means that if your definition of Indigenous identity is the possession of a tribal enrollment card, there are a lot of people who are not allowed those. And in this spectacularly illogical thing, some of those people can get a Bureau of Indian Affairs degree of Indian blood, CDIB card, degree of Indian blood card. So you can be a percentage Native and have that legally recognized and not be enrollable because of the weird politics. So I have friends who are California Native people, can prove that they're California Native people, but those tribes aren't recognized, and they are substantially more connected to their rituals than I am to mine, living as I do miles from where mine take place, and are not recognized as Native. So you parse that. Why is that important? Well, it's important because there are museums you can't show in unless you can wave one of those cards around. There are things you can't participate in and you can't wave one of those cards around. And there are religious objects that you cannot own because if you don't have one of those cards, you can't get the subsequent card that allows you to have those objects. So they can be seized at any time. So there's an identity thing to wrap your head around. There are solutions to that, but you know, that's tedious and boring. So we need to start sort of, and this is now the meta we, the United States citizen we need to start thinking about different ways of talking about, of interacting with, of identifying what an Indigenous identity is, because the current tools that are available for that are based in a lot of poor assumptions. I know, for example, in dealing with my own nation, Europeans who came and laid the foundation work for how we are seen did not speak to the women who were, by the way, often in charge of all of the stuff. When my ex met my Cherokee grandpa, he said, you know, you really want to think about this before you hook up with this woman, because that feminism thing, she didn't learn that at school. That's something that came with the family. So the various ways to understand who we are have been really skewed. One of my sort of precious moments of going to university, the first one was being promised. I went to university because I was promised a library I couldn't read my way through in 4 years. And that is literally true. I am that big a nerd. I was like, books, just promise me books. The second one was showing up in a class where the first thing that we tackled were autobiographies of Native women written in the 1800s. None of which were actually written by Native women, but they were called autobiographies anyway because they were reported to some anthropologist. Some of you will know, because you're educated people, that the right to narrate a story is at least as important as what's in the story. So the editorial that goes into it is at least as important. And so, for example, Pretty Shield, Medicine Woman of the Crow by Frank Speck. If he literally wrote down everything she said, it's still not accurate because of what he has, how he has freighted the facts, right? What weight is given to the facts in question, and it makes it wrong. There's another one called The Autobiography of a Fox Woman, in which you never learn her name. And I promise you that will have been important, her name. So how do I know these texts are still the texts? My son, my oldest son, has decided to go back to school. He originally was doing biology, and now he wants to do anthropology. And his very first anthropology class was disappointingly exactly like the 100 level anthropology class I was forced to take when I went to SF State, a class in which, by the way, the professor started off the segment about North American people by saying that we were incredibly inbred, identified that she had been born and raised in outside of Oberammergau, where her family had lived for years. And having studied German in high school, I went on a German trip when I graduated and found out that the odds of ever moving more than 5 miles from where you were born in that part of the world were vanishingly slim until the 60s. So I find the accusation of inbreeding rather interesting in a place where I saw whole families that had 6 kids that looked like different sizes of the same child, which suggests to me that there's not a whole lot of genetic diversity there either. But she also asked me for a casting of my teeth for the collection in the middle of class. A request that I made so unpleasant for her by going to literally everyone up the chain of command at school that I would have assumed that she'd stop doing it, except when I started teaching at San Francisco State, I had a hysterical student come in weeping because he'd been asked the same question by the same teacher who'd never stopped doing that thing. We really need to do better with one another, folks. It's absolutely imperative. I mean, I don't understand how that's allowed to continue. I was part of the system. I finally quit because I felt like I was selling snake oil. The odds of me ever teaching again are pretty vanishingly slim, because even though I've tried a couple of different places, I still felt like I was selling snake oil. And I'm not accusing any of the teachers in this room of anything in particular. I'm just saying, like, the thing that I teach, we don't do it well. We still don't do it well, and we're expected not to do it well, and we're encouraged not to do it very well. And I can't do that anymore because my emotional connection to my students was too great, and I just didn't want to further the trauma. And there is trauma. And I have been lucky. San Francisco was the icebreaker ship for New Think around a lot of stuff. San Francisco State was the first place to have a department of ethnic studies, whole department, right? And the free speech movement and all of those things. And, you know, the problem with evolving thought about how to communicate with one another is that you never actually get there. It's all a continual process, and we have to keep doing it. We have to keep doing it. And I decided it actually made more sense just to invite people over to my house one at a time. I haven't gotten to most of you yet, but my goal is, in educating people, just inviting people over one at a time, breaking bread together and comparing notes. And I think that's really fundamentally the best way. But if you take nothing else away from this, I ask you to it's never Native American culture. There are people who are here in California with vibrant, active cultures and communities who've been here since longer than science likes to admit. There are practices that would be making the current ecological problems a little bit less, a little bit less. But what is also true is that it's equally oppressive to view Indigenous knowledge as the solution that's going to save everybody. I think there have been too many movies like that. The magical Native person is not going to correct the problem, and we have to do it together, which means that we are on short time about knocking down the bullshit walls and just talking to one another quite honestly. You know, does it bother me that my current partner was married at a church that has a parking lot over the Indigenous burial there? Yep, it bothers me. That hurts my feelings. You know? Yes, it does. And I'm sure there's other stuff that other people are having issue with. This has been the sanctuary place for a lot of people over the last couple 100 years. And I'm sure we can figure out how to live together. We're not doing a real good job just now. So that's what I have to say. And I am now ready to entertain questions. And I'm really delighted you're here, Teresa. Thank you for being here. I saw that you wrote something. I haven't read it yet.
And George has his hand up.
Does George have his hand up? I'm not going to know that. So
So I'm going to try to.
somebody else jump in.
Yes, George.
So Kim, I'd love to hear about your creative process in general and to the extent to which that also intersects with your own thinking about identity.
I can't see everybody because most of you are just names. George, how much do you know about my work? Have you looked me up?
I've looked you up, but I have not yet read any of your poems.
Okay. Did you look at my artwork?
Not yet.
Yeah. So my process, without getting into detail, because the answer is different depending on whether you've read or seen stuff. Having been the mother of 3 people who were teenagers all at the same time, I have not been able to release the habit of waking up at like 3 in order to get a couple of hours in when I'm not being disrupted by the needs, the legitimate needs, but the needs nonetheless of small people. So I get up really early every morning and I write a page and I do some of my visual art usually a little later when I get natural light, because I'm a regalia maker. Do people know what that means? Yes, sort of. Yeah, kind of. I make stuff that people carry into ceremony with them. So it's kind of an important job. And I use very, very small beads in my beadwork. You've held some of my stuff, Tori. My beads are small. I work with like 15s, 13s, whereas what you've probably seen a lot more are 10s. And I've got arguably elderly eyes, so I like to use natural light. I don't draw very well, but I can do shapes. So my process for beadwork, tends to be making little sketches that don't end up looking at all like what I end up with, and then building them out of what are essentially poppy seed size beads. The stories I tell are traditional to me, or they are, it's okay, or they are traditional to the people for whom I'm making things. A weird thing that started happening to me in the last 4 years is that people have sought me out from other tribal entities to make things for them to take into ceremony. And so in order to do that, I need to learn about people's stuff. And I need to just say I'm grateful for the trust that demonstrates. So my process is that I work my butt off every day.
Excellent. Thank you.
Anybody else? I've either been very confusing or I've answered all the questions. Teresa, how you doing?
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. No, I just loved hearing you talk about complicated identities. And I think that all of us, most Native people have complicated identities. And I think that in more traditional times, they weren't as complicated because when you came into wherever you lived, you became that identity, that culture. And I know my cousins, elder cousins from the Pueblo said when they would marry into another Pueblo, the Pueblo they married into would rename them. And so I appreciate you talking about how complicated it is and how negotiating questions, really takes a tie on us because we're constantly trying to figure out how genuine we want to be or how snarky we might feel if it's a question that we've heard over and over and over and we're tired. So
tired is real. That's so real. I mean, there are questions I've heard so often. I have about 5 different answers depending on who I want to piss off, and it's real. It's not aided by I mean, California is so complicated, and I feel like what you said about the Department of Interior only consulting with federally recognized tribes, there are a lot of entities apart from the federal government who only want to talk to federally recognized tribes. And one of the reasons I ended up getting a master's degree in art was to get some people who wanted to look at some baskets into some collections they couldn't get into off their own bat. And I needed a degree for it, but I also needed my tribal ID, I feel like it's always really important for me to mention that I'm a guest here, and I think I behave like one. I mean, I definitely, I have a position in kind of the political clique scene now. So when I started being recognized as so-and-so's friend, I felt like maybe I had kind of made it in, but you just try to be as helpful as you can. One of the weird questions I get asked a lot by enrolled people in my own tribe who are from California but have no direct connection to either of the main centers of Cherokee identity. How do you learn stuff? It's like, you learn stuff the way you learn stuff in any community. Carry water, chop wood. Make yourself useful. And it won't happen tomorrow. But eventually it does. I was saying before that you got here, when it was just a couple people before the thing started, that like Tori's Tori's for real. She showed up. I had invited her over to my house, and she showed up with vegetables and flowers and things and stuff. Like, did the whole arrival thing. I feel like if it weren't a city, you probably would have sat out in front of the house in your truck until we came out to invite you in. Yeah, I've spent a little time on the Navajo. Anyway, anybody else? Yes, sir.
As the priest in charge of the church that has a parking lot built on a burial site, I want to acknowledge that first and ask you if you have any any insight or wisdom about what steps that one could take in my position you might suggest?
I would talk to some coastal DUoC people about it. Weirdly, because of who one of my aunts was, if this was a question that was about the exact same thing in some of our tribal lands, I would know what to say. But this is one of those ones where I am unqualified to answer the question. But I really appreciate that you said that, because I did know who you were when you were introduced, and it's a painful thing. And I think we need to treat one another's remains with respect. And I appreciate you acknowledging that.
Thank you.
George has another hand.
I do. I'm that person. So Kim and also
Okay.
Teresa, I welcome both of y'all's insights here. Another request for advice. Any of us with mixed ancestry, whether thinking through ourselves, thinking through from a parenting standpoint, how to handle being perhaps partially Indigenous or having inherited rumors of your part Cherokee, that sort of thing. Recommendations for what to do with that?
So I'm a weirdo with this respect, and I count my wealth in terms of relatives. Okay. My recommendation would be to look into it. Now, this is not an easy thing to do, and I've seen it go badly for some people because whereas I feel like all of the traditional stories suggest that we are an incredibly welcoming group of people, the trauma has created a situation where that's not universally the case anymore. So I think we're back to, I mean, look into it, right? But even then, I'm debating saying a thing that's going to be really questionable. There are Cherokee organizations in California, and I would suggest that you look into, if that's the rumored tribal identity, I would look into that. I would also suggest that you not get too disappointed if it turns out not to be the case, because a lot of people said that. But having said which, what Teresa said is absolutely correct, is that you ended up part of the community that you were near, that you were living in. Okay, so there are a lot of people who, from my perspective as a fairly traditional person, I would view as Cherokee that will not be viewed as Cherokee because of the Dawes Act and a number of things that would take hours to talk about, right? So just know that that's not an easy identity. I wish you greatest luck with it. And there's certainly things that you can teach your children. Get my email address. I've got a reading list.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
George, I would suggest is getting to know community, depending on where you live, attending community events, sometimes just being present and learning like what your local Native community is or what they do, or, people show up all the time. I showed up one day at Intertribal Friendship House in the 80s. And, it's by continued participation, showing up with a potluck meal. And, at community events, there's Native, non-Natives, there's everyone. So I think that it's really just being consistently, showing up, and then people kind of get to know you. You know them, and that has, I've seen a number of people who were interested in kind of learning of what their native background was and attend, or people like me who were adopted and know they're native and show up and become part of the community. So yeah, it's really kind of getting out there and just meeting people, and making friendships.
Excellent. Thank you, Teresa.
That's what the Marin Indian Alliance is there for, which, you know, I had been a part of at some points, but that they did a group, I think they do third Tuesdays in San Rafael at the Methodist Church. And then there's every Thursday at the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland. They have a feast. And that's a wonderful place to go. It's full of history. You just feel it when you walk in there. It feels like I could be back in New Mexico and Shiprock when I'm there. It smells the same. It feels the same when there's all these women in the kitchen cooking all the stuff, and there's just always buzzing children and everything. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I love
Thank you.
that place. That's a great place to go and to be. And it has been for a long time.
I think it's one of the oldest Indian centers in the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, the other thing that we have in the Bay Area that's the oldest is we have the oldest continuous Native American run radio program. And different people will tell you it's different ones. But Mary Jean Robertson's been doing one for, I think it's over 45 years now, continually, her and Tavia. So there's ways to find out what issues are of primary concern to the community here. If you want to do that before you start plugging in, and you can listen to that show. I believe it's every Wednesday, except the first Wednesday of the month. And you can live stream that from KPOO radio. But there's also Bay Native Circle, which is really good. Also deals with great stuff. Different people host that. That's on KPFA. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. And I haven't read your poetry, so I just want to start with that. Sorry, but I'm excited that you are a poet and I want to read it. But I'm curious if you have any influences for your poetry or your writing, be it Indigenous or non-Indigenous.
Yeah, both actually. I probably started writing poetry. I'll be real honest with you, and I don't think I've ever said this out loud anywhere, so write this one down. I either started writing poetry because of Cicely Mary Barker's Flower Fairy books, or I started writing because there is a tradition, religious tradition for my people of going to water, which involves writing a thing I'm going to call a poem and offering it to the water. And maybe I started writing for both of those reasons. But one of my, I've had a couple of really incredible mentors over the years. One of them was Carol Lee Sanchez. If you haven't read her, you must. One of them was Susan Sibbett, who is another not well enough known writer. Devorah Major was one of my mentors for a period of time. I have been incredibly lucky on top of all of it. And it didn't hurt growing up in San Francisco when you could still wander around in North Beach and have Bob Kaufman accost you with a poem, which happened to me more than once. because I would periodically buy him food. So he would yell poetry at me. I remember one time the police were like, "Are you all right, man?" I'm like, "I'm fine." It's just aggressive poetry, that's all. So, anybody else? If you can get a copy of it and you haven't read my work at all, and in keeping with the topic, I wrote a book called Murdered Missing, which is 55 days straight of poems, one a day, about women, Indigenous women who've been vanished or killed. We lost my daughter about 10 years ago. I know that one's kind of a cold cup of coffee, huh?
Yeah.
All of the money from that's donated to an organization that's dedicated to mapping the deaths, because about 12 years ago, I was asked to read at an event commemorating this. I was reading with some women from Juarez, a woman from Calgary, another woman from Vancouver, and I was the only one who didn't have numbers because the United States was not tracking it. There was no way to know what the numbers were. The San Francisco Bay Area is like 8th on the list of most dangerous places for Native women to be, by the way. And most people have no idea that that's true. So I don't get a penny from it. I'm suggesting you buy a book I don't get paid for doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel like that opened up some doors I've never opened before. So thank you.
There's my niece is a linguist who teaches at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and she calls these things that I do poetry actions, because I've done it a number of times where I write a poem a day about a specific subject. But we stopped at 55 that time because my family staged an intervention. They didn't think it was psychologically good for me to continue to think about it every day. It's probably correct. Some of you know that when this is over, I get to go off to a dental appointment. And so I'm going to encourage you to dig deep and ask me a question to put off that thrilling moment.
Well, I could ask a question if, and maybe this is the last question unless somebody raised their hands really quickly and, block it off. For folks who are not Indigenous, what do you want us to do? What do you wish that people would do to be good neighbors and good allies?
I really think that probably the biggest problem for Indigenous communities is our invisibility. So I'm going to suggest that you make yourself aware of the people you live around. Whose land are you on? And what are they up to now? And I promise you from the depths of my heart that even if you look it up and find out that they're gone, they're not. I promise you they're not. I have read all over this country and all over Canada, and I have frequently found out that the people whose land I was on that given week were extinct, only to find that that was nonsense. So I'm going to tell you it's nonsense right up. Just dig, keep digging.
No, thank you. And that's exactly, some of my students are working with Tori this semester, and the first thing they looked into is all the statistics and data set. And this, what the students found, it's very interesting. They said, we're trying to show that the Indigenous communities marginalized in Marin County. The problem is there's no statistics about it. That's how invisible this community is.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that's precisely the problem, isn't it? And so, and I think that's part of why we're doing this series and we're partnering with Tori and the museum so that we could change a little bit of that.
Mhm.
But thank you for pointing that out. I think, that is a very important step, is to become more aware.
We had, for years, we had a style of song in Cherokee that was about being invisible to our enemies. And I started writing a different version of the same style in which we insist on being visible. The thought was that we hadn't been invisible enough. I think the songs worked and we really are invisible. And I think we need to like reverse that now. Thank you so much for having me. We are now at 1:01. Let's see.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
We appreciate
Thank
you.
you.
And then we do have a public panel upcoming on November 18th, and Kim will come back again to be part of that panel. So if you are interested to see Kim again, and also Teresa and Tori will be there, do come and join us.
Also, I perform on Zoom these days mostly, but I perform at least twice, 3 times, 4 times a week. So there's always look me up if you want to hear more from me.
Thank you.
I'm not hard to find.
All right,
Thank you, Kim.
Take care.
Thanks,
Thank
Kim.
you.
Good luck at the dentist.
Cam.
Thank you.
Right.
I'm always afraid what they're going to find.
That's why I haven't made an appointment. I'm scared.
I
You're
hate it.
young.
I don't
Well,
know.
this is what I get for being with somebody who doesn't understand the residual trauma that Indian Health provided us all with, man. I'm like always white knuckling going in. So
Yeah.
bad.
Okay.
Well, we wish you the best luck. No cavities.
Well, I doubt if I do. It's
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, Teresa, thank you so much for being here. Honestly, you have to come over to supper now that we're coming out of this pandemic thing. You guys have to come over and eat at our house.
I've got who you persimmons to share.
Oh my goodness. Doug that's his favorite fruit, his
Me
persimmon.
too. Yeah.
Oh, this is the season.
Uh-huh.
No.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice.
Okay.
Thank
All
you
right.
all for being here.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Take care.